Imagine a machine so massive, so terrifying, so absolutely unprecedented in human history that the entire Soviet Union reorganized its air defense strategy just because it existed. Imagine a single airplane, one single aircraft, capable of flying from a base in Texas, dropping a nuclear bomb anywhere on Earth, and returning home without ever needing to land, refuel, or ask for help. Imagine a plane so loud, so powerful, so impossible to ignore that the ground literally shook when it passed overhead, and people miles away thought an earthquake had struck. That machine was real. That machine flew. That machine changed the world. And today, we are going to tell its complete story. Welcome to the full, unfiltered, deeply researched history of the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, the most powerful piston engine bomber ever built, the aircraft that defined the Cold War before the Cold War even had a name, and the flying giant that carried the nickname that said everything you needed to know about how it worked. 6 turning for burning. Before we go any further, let me paint you a picture of just how enormous this aircraft really was. The B-36 had a wingspan of 230 feet. 230 feet. To put that into perspective, the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903 covered only 120 feet. The entire first powered flight in human history could have taken place completely inside the wingspan of the B-36 Peacemaker, with room to spare. This was not an airplane in the traditional sense of the word. This was a flying cathedral, a winged fortress of such breathtaking scale that engineers who worked on it in the 1940s said they genuinely felt intimidated standing next to it. Ground crews working on the engines had to climb ladders just to reach the wing roots. The fuselage was so wide and so long that it contained pressurized crew tunnels connecting different sections of the aircraft. Men crawled through tubes running through the bomb bays on little wheeled carts, like miners navigating underground passages, just to move from the front of the plane to the rear. This was not a weapons system. This was a flying civilization, and it was born from desperation. The story of the B-36 does not begin in a comfortable boardroom or a well-funded research laboratory. It begins with the darkest moment of the Second World War, when American military planners looked at a map of Europe in 1941 and felt a cold, creeping dread settle into their bones. Britain was under siege. The Nazis had overrun France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway. The Atlantic was being hunted by German submarines. And American military strategists began asking themselves a question that nobody wanted to answer out loud. What if Britain falls? What if the Germans take the British Isles? What if we lose our bases in England? How do we strike back at Nazi Germany from American soil? How do we reach across the Atlantic Ocean and bring the war to the enemy when our closest ally no longer exists? That question drove the United States Army Air Forces to issue one of the most ambitious aircraft requirements in aviation history. In April of 1941, they asked American manufacturers to design and build a bomber capable of flying from bases in the continental United States to targets in Europe, a round trip of 10,000 miles, carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs at altitudes above 40,000 feet, at speeds over 300 miles per hour. This was not a specification. It was a wish list written by people who were not entirely sure the technology to meet it even existed yet. But Consolidated Aircraft Corporation of Fort Worth, Texas believed they could do it, and they began to work. The design that emerged from Consolidated's engineering teams was radical in almost every way. The plane would be powered by 6 massive Pratt & Whitney R-4360 Wasp major radial engines, the most powerful piston aircraft engines ever built, each one containing 28 cylinders arranged in 4 rows of 7. Displacing 4,360 cubic inches and producing up to 3,800 horsepower. 6 of these monsters, mounted in a pusher configuration, meaning the propellers faced backward, pushing the aircraft forward rather than pulling it, would drive the B-36 across the sky. But that still was not enough. In later variants, for General Electric, J-47 jet engines were added in pairs of pods under each wing, bringing the total power plant count to 10 engines. 6 reciprocating piston engines pushing, for jet engines blasting. 6 turning, for burning. That phrase, coined by the flight crews who flew her, captures the strange, almost baroque complexity of this aircraft perfectly. It was as if the engineers had looked at both the past and the future of aviation simultaneously, grabbed handfuls of each, and bolted them together into one extraordinary machine. The development of the B-36 was tortuously slow, largely because the Second World War itself kept changing priorities. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the focus of American industrial might shifted dramatically toward aircraft that could be built quickly and deployed immediately. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the B-29 Superfortress. The B-36, with its enormous complexity and its demands on manufacturing resources that were already stretched to the breaking point, was repeatedly delayed. The first prototype, the XB-36, did not roll out of the Fort Worth factory until September of 1945, 1 month after Japan surrendered and the Second World War ended. The war the B-36 had been designed to fight was over before it ever flew. And yet the world it flew into was, in some ways, even more dangerous than the one it had been designed for. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, had emerged from the Second World War as a continental superpower, controlling Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans, pursuing nuclear weapons research with furious intensity, and making absolutely clear through the words of Joseph Stalin and the actions of the Soviet state that the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism would continue, intensify, and potentially erupt into open warfare. American military planners found themselves staring at essentially the same problem they had faced in 1941. How do you strike at a massive Eurasian power from bases in North America? But with nuclear weapons now in the equation, the stakes were incomparably higher. The atomic bomb had changed everything. A single aircraft carrying a single weapon could now destroy an entire city. And the B-36, with its intercontinental range and its enormous bomb bay, was the only aircraft in the American arsenal that could carry atomic weapons to targets deep inside the Soviet Union from bases inside the United States. The XB-36 made its first flight on August 8, 1946, from Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. The test pilot was Beryl Erickson, a Consolidated Company test pilot of extraordinary skill and nerve. The flight lasted 37 minutes and covered a distance sufficient to evaluate the basic airworthiness of the design. Erickson later described the experience of flying the XB-36 as unlike anything he had ever encountered. The aircraft was responsive and stable, but its sheer size created visual and sensory experiences that had no parallel in his previous flying career. Looking out the cockpit windows at the massive wings stretching away on either side, at the 6 pusher propellers churning the air behind the engines, at the ground dropping away from underneath 230 feet of aluminum, was, he said, genuinely surreal. The production version, designated the B-36A, began entering service with Strategic Air Command in 1948. Strategic Air Command, SAC, was the nuclear strike force of the United States Air Force, the organization responsible for delivering atomic weapons against enemy targets in the event of war. Its commander in 1948 was General Curtis LeMay, one of the most formidable and controversial military figures in American history. LeMay had commanded the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan, had personally approved the firebombing raids that destroyed Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities, and had played a central role in the decisions that led to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was blunt, relentless, and utterly focused on combat effectiveness. And when he took command of SAC, he found an organization that was, in his assessment, dangerously unprepared for the mission it had been assigned. LeMay's first evaluation of SAC's readiness, conducted through a series of simulated bombing missions in 1948 and 1949, produced results that alarmed him profoundly. Crews were undertrained. Navigation was poor. Bombing accuracy was terrible. Aircraft were poorly maintained. SAC was, in LeMay's blunt assessment, not a combat unit. He proceeded to transform it with a ferocity and discipline that became legendary, and sometimes feared, throughout the Air Force. Training intensified dramatically. Standards rose sharply, and the B-36, the centerpiece of SAC's nuclear strike capability, became the focus of an enormous organizational effort to develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures needed to actually use it effectively in combat. The aircraft that LeMay's crews were learning to fly was, in its mature form, a machine of genuinely staggering capability. The B-36D, which introduced the 4-jet engine pods and became the definitive early production variant, could fly a combat mission of 10,000 miles at an average speed of approximately 235 miles per hour, reaching altitudes of over 40,000 feet, high enough that early Soviet interceptor aircraft simply could not reach it. The bomb bay, divided into 4 separate sections, could carry an almost bewildering variety of ordnance. Conventional bombs, incendiary bombs, the Mark 17 thermonuclear weapon, the most powerful bomb ever carried by an operational aircraft, with a yield of approximately 10 to 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The B-36 could carry 2 of these weapons simultaneously. 2 thermonuclear bombs, each capable of obliterating any city on Earth, in a single aircraft, flown by a crew of 15 men. Those 15 men lived in a world unlike anything their counterparts in smaller aircraft experienced. The B-36's crew was divided between 2 pressurized compartments connected by that remarkable crawl tunnel running through the bomb bay section. The forward compartment, containing the flight deck, the navigator's station, the bombardier's position, and the radio operator's area, was the primary working and living space for most of the crew. There were bunks for off-duty crew members. There was a small galley where simple meals could be prepared during missions that could last 24 hours or more. There was even, in later variants, a small compartment that served as something approaching a lavatory. By the standards of the time, the B-36's crew accommodations were luxurious. By the standards of comfort that most human beings would recognize as acceptable, they were still austere almost beyond description, cramped, noisy, vibrating constantly from the combined output of 10 enormous engines, and bitterly cold at high altitude despite the pressurization systems. The noise, in particular, was a defining characteristic of the B-36 experience. The 6 Wasp major engines, running in pusher configuration at full power, produced a sound that was unlike anything else in the inventory of propeller-driven aircraft. It was deeper than the sound of conventional tractor configuration engines, more rhythmic, more visceral, a sound that ground observers described as a throb or a pulse rather than a roar. People who lived near Carswell Air Force Base and the other B-36 bases remembered that sound for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of American nuclear deterrence in the early Cold War. It was the sound of national security policy flying overhead at 400 miles per hour. And for the Soviet military planners who received intelligence reports about the B-36's capabilities, it was the sound of a strategic problem that they did not yet know how to solve. The Soviets' inability to effectively intercept the B-36 at high altitude was one of the most significant military realities of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Their primary interceptor aircraft of the period, the MiG-15, itself a formidable machine that gave American pilots serious difficulties in the Korean War, had an operational ceiling of approximately 50,000 feet, but its effective combat ceiling at speeds needed to actually intercept and engage a target was considerably lower. A B-36 flying at 45,000 feet and above was essentially immune to MiG-15 interception. Soviet anti-aircraft guns of the period were similarly ineffective at those altitudes. For a window of several years in the late 1940s and very early 1950s, the B-36 could, in theory, fly over Soviet territory with relatively limited risk of being shot down. This was not an idle boast or a piece of American propaganda. It was a military reality that the Soviet Union found deeply alarming, and that drove them to invest heavily in improved interceptor aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, and radar systems. Investments that would eventually close the window of B-36 invulnerability, but that took years to develop and deploy. While the B-36 was establishing itself as the backbone of American nuclear deterrence, it was also becoming the center of one of the most dramatic and consequential bureaucratic battles in the history of the American military. The controversy that erupted in 1949, sometimes called the Revolt of the Admirals, pitted the United States Air Force and its B-36 centered strategic bombing doctrine directly against the United States Navy, which was fighting for its institutional survival in the new nuclear age. The argument was, at its core, about money and about strategic philosophy. The Air Force argued that nuclear deterrence, the threat of immediate and overwhelming nuclear retaliation against any aggressor, was the only rational strategy for preventing World War III, and that the B-36 was the instrument through which that deterrence would be exercised. The Navy argued that this approach was strategically bankrupt, morally questionable, and practically problematic, and that the true requirement for national security was a balanced force capable of fighting at all levels of conflict, conventional as well as nuclear, naval as well as aerial. The Navy had its own proposed solution to the strategic problem, a new class of supercarriers capable of operating aircraft large enough to carry nuclear weapons. The first of these, the USS United States, had been authorized and its keel had actually been laid. But Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, in a decision that stunned the Navy's leadership, canceled the United States in April of 1949, just 5 days after her keel laying, and redirected the money toward the B-36 program. The Navy erupted. Senior admirals openly questioned the Air Force's claims about the B-36's capabilities and its strategic effectiveness. Anonymous documents appeared in Washington accusing the Air Force and defense contractors of fraud, corruption, and dishonesty in the procurement process. Congressional hearings were held. Testimony was given. Careers were made and broken. The hearings themselves were extraordinary. A public airing of the most sensitive strategic and military questions at a level of detail and frankness that was almost without precedent. Admiral Arthur Radford, who led the Navy's case against the B-36, argued that the aircraft was a sitting duck for Soviet interceptors, that its claimed ability to reach Soviet targets was exaggerated, that its bombing accuracy at high altitude was insufficient to reliably destroy hardened targets, and that the entire strategic bombing doctrine that the Air Force had built around it was morally bankrupt because it relied on the mass destruction of civilian populations rather than the precise destruction of military targets. These were serious arguments, made by serious men with genuine expertise. And the Air Force's responses, made by equally serious men with equally genuine expertise, were that the Navy's admirals were motivated primarily by institutional self-interest rather than strategic logic, that the B-36's capabilities were accurately represented, and that nuclear deterrence, however uncomfortable its moral implications, was the only realistic way to prevent a third world war. In the end, the Air Force largely prevailed in this bureaucratic battle. The supercarrier program was not immediately revived. Curtis LeMay continued building SAC around the B-36 B-36, and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence through strategic bombing remained the cornerstone of American national security policy. But the revolt of the admirals had lasting consequences. It forced the Air Force to be more transparent about the B-36's actual capabilities and limitations. It planted questions in congressional minds about the wisdom of relying too heavily on any single weapons system. And it ultimately contributed to the development of a more genuinely balanced American military posture, though that development took years and proceeded through considerable conflict. The B-36 also made its mark in the world of aviation records. In January of 1951, a B-36 flew nonstop from Carswell Air Force Base in Texas to a point over Hawaii and back to Carswell, covering approximately 8,000 miles in a single flight, demonstrating in unmistakable terms that the aircraft's intercontinental range claims were not theoretical but thoroughly practical. In exercises and war games, B-36 regularly flew simulated nuclear strike missions against American cities, approaching their targets at high altitude and high speed, and consistently demonstrating that they could reach and attack defended targets with acceptable loss rates. American air defense commanders found the B-36 a frustrating adversary in these exercises. Intercepting it reliably was genuinely difficult with the aircraft and radar systems available in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But technology was moving fast. The jet age was transforming military aviation at a pace that made piston-engine aircraft obsolete with startling speed. The Soviet Union was developing new interceptor aircraft, the MiG-17 and, eventually, the MiG-19, with performance characteristics that substantially eroded the B-36's high-altitude sanctuary. Surface-to-air missiles were moving from laboratory experiments to operational deployment. Radar coverage over the Soviet Union and over the approaches to the United States was expanding and improving. The world in which the B-36 had been genuinely invulnerable at high altitude was shrinking year by year. And the Air Force was already developing the aircraft that would replace it, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, a true all-jet bomber with performance characteristics that left the B-36 far behind. The B-36's final operational variant was the B-36J, which introduced additional fuel capacity, stronger landing gear to handle increased gross weights, and various systems improvements. 462 B-36s of all variants were ultimately built, making it one of the larger production runs of any heavy bomber in history. They served with Strategic Air Command at bases including Carswell in Texas, Ellsworth in South Dakota, Fairchild in Washington, Ramey in Puerto Rico, and several other locations. At its peak in the early 1950s, SAC operated more than 300 B-36s as its primary nuclear strike force. The crews who flew them developed an intimate, complicated relationship with the aircraft. Ground crews, the mechanics, the crew chiefs, the specialists who kept these enormously complex machines airworthy, worked extraordinarily long hours under demanding conditions. A B-36 with 10 engines, each one a complex mechanical system in its own right, generated a maintenance burden that was almost overwhelming. The WASP major engines were particularly notorious for reliability problems. With 28 cylinders and an oil system of enormous complexity, they were prone to leaks, to fouling, to overheating in ways that simpler engines were not. Ground crews developed near-encyclopedic knowledge of the specific quirks and characteristics of individual aircraft. This B-36 ran hot on number 3 engine. That one had a hydraulic system that needed checking before every flight. Another had a tendency for the radar to go intermittent in cold weather. Flight crews, meanwhile, developed the specialized skills and stamina required for missions that could last from 12 to over 24 hours. Navigation was a critical discipline, flying 10,000 miles round trip with no landmarks. no radio navigation aids over enemy territory, and no margin for error required navigators of exceptional skill. The celestial navigation techniques that B-36 navigators mastered, shooting stars through sextant ports in the aircraft's skin, plotting positions from the movements of the sun and moon and planets, were arts that had been practiced by seafarers for centuries, but had to be performed in a vibrating, pressurized metal tube at 40,000 feet, while the aircraft proceeded at nearly 400 miles per hour through the darkness over the Arctic. The Arctic was, in fact, central to the B-36's strategic mission in a way that is not always appreciated. The shortest routes between the continental United States and the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, the cities of Moscow, Leningrad, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, ran over the Arctic Ocean, across the polar ice cap. These routes were hundreds of miles shorter than any alternative, and the B-36's missions were planned to exploit them whenever possible. This meant flying in some of the most hostile weather conditions on Earth. Extreme cold that could cause hydraulic systems to freeze and control surfaces to stiffen, icing conditions that could load the wings and engines with potentially fatal accumulations of ice, navigation challenges created by the fact that magnetic compasses are unreliable near the geographic poles. B-36 crews trained extensively for Arctic operations, some of them deploying to forward operating locations in Alaska and northern Canada to practice the specific challenges of polar flight. One of the most remarkable episodes in B-36 history occurred on February 13, 1950, and involved not a simulated mission but a genuine emergency over the Pacific Ocean. A B-36B, serial number 44 to 92,075, had departed Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska on a training mission simulating a nuclear strike against San Francisco. The aircraft was carrying a Mark IV nuclear weapon, but without the nuclear core, which was stored separately as a safety measure. 12 hours into the mission, 3 of the 6 engines caught fire. The crew fought the fires but was unable to extinguish them. With the aircraft losing altitude and becoming impossible to control, the crew made 2 fateful decisions. First, they jettisoned the nuclear weapon over the Pacific Ocean near Princess Royal Island off the coast of British Columbia, where it detonated its conventional explosives on impact, scattering uranium components into the water below. Second, 17 of the crew of 17 bailed out. 5 were never found. The remaining 12 were eventually rescued. The aircraft itself continued flying on autopilot for some time before crashing into a remote mountain area. This incident, now known as the first American nuclear accident or Broken Arrow, remained classified for decades. It was the first time in history that a nuclear weapon had been lost, and it established procedures and protocols for handling such incidents that would, unfortunately, be needed again in the years to come. The nuclear component of the bomb was not aboard. The actual fissile material was absent, but the incident nonetheless demonstrated with brutal clarity that the operational use of nuclear weapons involved risks that extended far beyond the theoretical calculations of strategic planners. These were real machines, flown by real men, carrying real weapons, and sometimes things went terribly wrong. The B-36 force participated in many exercises and demonstrations of American air power during its operational life, and one of the most significant was the testing of a concept that now seems almost fantastical: the use of the B-36 as a parasite aircraft carrier for fighter jets. The idea was straightforward in concept and remarkable in execution. Because the B-36 was so large, and because its bomb bay was so enormous, it was theoretically possible to carry a small fighter aircraft inside the bomb bay, deploy it for combat in the target area, and then recover it back into the bomb bay for the return journey. The fighter would provide local air defense for the bomber against interceptors in the target area, addressing one of the B-36's acknowledged vulnerabilities: its relative lack of agility and its large size made it potentially vulnerable to well-directed fighter attacks, even at high altitude. The program that developed to test this concept was called Project TomTom, and its successor project, which used a small jet fighter called the McDonnell XF-85 Goblin. The Goblin was designed from scratch to fit inside the B-36 bomb bay. It had no conventional landing gear, instead using a retractable skyhook that would mate with a trapeze mechanism lowered from the bomb bay. In flight, the trapeze would lower the Goblin below the B-36. The Goblin's pilot would start the engine, disengage from the trapeze, and fly off independently. To recover, the pilot would fly back under the B-36, match its speed precisely, then attempt to hook back onto the trapeze. This was an extraordinarily demanding piece of flying, requiring the Goblin pilot to hold formation with a 230-foot bomber while simultaneously maneuvering a skyhook fitting into a relatively small target on the trapeze. In turbulence, at high altitude, with jet exhaust from the Goblin's engine adding to the visual and physical challenges. Test flights conducted in 1948 and 1949 showed that the concept was technically feasible but operationally impractical. The Goblin successfully launched from and recovered to a B-36 in multiple test flights, but the trapeze recovery process was so difficult and so demanding that the Air Force ultimately concluded it was too risky for operational use. The program was canceled, and the XF-85 Goblin entered history as one of aviation's most interesting dead ends, a genuinely innovative solution to a real tactical problem that the limits of human pilot capability and the inherent turbulence around a large aircraft made impractical. A second parasite concept, using a larger and more capable fighter, the RF-84F Thunderflash, and a somewhat different launching and recovery mechanism, was also tested under Project TomTom. This program also showed that the basic concept worked, but that recovery in particular remained dangerously difficult. During one test, the fighter made contact with the B-36 wing during a recovery attempt, causing damage to both aircraft and nearly destroying both. The program was canceled in 1956. The parasite fighter concept, for all its elegance, never became an operational reality. More successful and more lasting in its impact was the B-36's role in the development of American nuclear weapons themselves. The enormous bomb bay of the B-36, with its 4 separate compartments, and its ability to carry weapons of very large physical size and weight, made it the natural test bed for the development of the large thermonuclear weapons of the early 1950s. The Mark 17, the Mark 24, and other massive thermonuclear devices of that era were designed with the B-36's physical carrying capacity in mind. The relationship between the aircraft and the weapon was intimate and reciprocal. The bomb influenced the plane, and the plane influenced the bomb. Weapons designers at Los Alamos and Sandia Laboratories worked closely with Convair engineers to ensure that the largest and most destructive weapons in the American nuclear arsenal could actually be transported by the aircraft that would deliver them. This relationship reached its most extreme expression in the development of what nuclear historians sometimes call the city busters, the enormous thermonuclear weapons of the early 1950s that were large not because the physics demanded it, but because the engineering of the time had not yet found ways to miniaturize the complex arrangements of explosives, uranium, and fusion fuel that made thermonuclear weapons work. The Mark 17, for example, weighed approximately 42,000 pounds and was about 25 feet long. It was so large that it could only fit in the B-36's bomb bay with special modifications, and only 2 aircraft types were ever capable of carrying it: the B-36 and the later B-52. The very existence of weapons of this size says something profound about the strategic doctrine of the era. These were not weapons designed for precision use against military targets. They were weapons designed for the complete and total destruction of entire metropolitan areas, and the B-36 was the vehicle chosen to carry them. By the mid-1950s, the handwriting was on the wall for the B-36. The Soviet Union had introduced the MiG-19, a supersonic interceptor that could reach the B-36's operating altitudes and engage it effectively. Surface-to-air missiles were entering Soviet service in significant numbers. The American radar network that the B-36's crews had to penetrate to reach Soviet targets was becoming better understood by Soviet air defense planners, who were developing the tactics and the equipment to exploit it. The high-altitude sanctuary that had been the B-36's most important tactical advantage was closing, and the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which had made its first flight in April of 1952, was becoming available in increasing numbers, a true all-jet bomber faster, higher flying, and in many ways more capable than the B-36 it was designed to replace. The phase-out of the B-36 from Strategic Air Command began in 1956 and accelerated through 1958 and into 1959. The last B-36J was retired from active service on February 12, 1959, almost exactly 13 years after the first flight of the prototype. During those 13 years, the B-36 had served as the cornerstone of American nuclear deterrence during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Years that included the Berlin blockade, the communist victory in China, the Korean War, the first Soviet atomic bomb test, the first Soviet thermonuclear bomb test, the death of Stalin, the Hungarian Revolution, and the Suez Crisis. Through all of it, the B-36 had sat on alert at its bases, armed with thermonuclear weapons, crewed by men who knew that the phone call ordering them into the air might come at any moment. It never did. The war the B-36 was built to fight never happened. And that, its advocates argued, was precisely the point. The existence of the B-36, the knowledge, in Moscow as well as Washington, that America possessed a weapon capable of reaching any target on Soviet soil, was itself the deterrent. The peace, such as it was kept in part by the threat embodied in that enormous aluminum aircraft sitting on the ramp at Carswell and Ellsworth and Fairchild in the frozen early morning, waiting. The fate of most of the 462 B-36s built was the fate common to obsolete military aircraft. The smelter, the aluminum, the steel, the copper wiring, the titanium fittings were all too valuable to leave sitting and used in the desert. Most B-36s were scrapped with a thoroughness and dispatch that later aviation historians and preservationists would find heartbreaking. The aircraft that had defined American military power for a decade, that had flown the nuclear deterrence missions that kept the peace during the most dangerous period of the early Cold War, that had represented the absolute cutting edge of American aerospace technology, were cut up and melted down. Only a handful survived. Today, complete B-36s can be seen at only a small number of locations in the United States. The most famous survivor is the aircraft on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. A B-36J that was preserved essentially complete and can be seen by visitors walking underneath its enormous wing, looking up at the 10-engine nacelles, trying to comprehend the scale of the machine that looms above them. The Castle Air Museum in Atwater, California preserves another example. The Strategic Air and Space Museum in Ashland, Nebraska has a third. Each of these aircraft draws visitors who come specifically to see the B-36, who have read about it or heard about it, and want to stand in its presence and understand, with their own eyes and their own sense of physical scale, what it meant for this machine to exist. Those visitors often report the same experience. They arrive at the museum knowing that the B-36 is large. They have read the numbers: 230-foot wingspan, 162-foot length, maximum takeoff weight of nearly 400,000 pounds. They think they are prepared, and then they walk into the presence of the actual aircraft and discover that no amount of intellectual preparation is equal to the physical reality. It is simply indescribably large. It is large in a way that makes the mind struggle and the imagination reach. Standing beneath the wing, which rises above you like the wing of some enormous prehistoric creature, feeling the visual weight of those 6-engine nacelles and 4-jet pods, understanding that men flew this thing, 15 men, in 2 pressurized compartments connected by a crawl tunnel, for missions lasting up to 24 hours, in all weather, over the Arctic, carrying weapons capable of ending civilization. You are confronted with something that goes beyond simple admiration for engineering achievement. You are confronted with the sheer, raw enormity of what the Cold War was, what it meant, what it cost, in treasure and in human ingenuity, and in the constant tension of living under the shadow of potential annihilation. The men who flew and maintained the B-36 are now old, those who survive. The youngest crew members from the aircraft's operational service are in their 90s. Their numbers are dwindling every year, as they do for every generation of veterans. But their memories, preserved in oral histories and memoirs and the records of organizations like the B-36 Peacemakers Association, paint a picture of service that was unglamorous, demanding, frequently uncomfortable, occasionally terrifying, and profoundly important. They flew their missions, practiced their bombing runs, maintained their alert postures, and went home to their families on the bases where they lived. They were, in many ways, the most important soldiers of the Cold War, the men whose readiness, whose training, whose willingness to do the job was the actual substance of the deterrence that the theorists and strategists talked about in abstractions. The B-36 was only as effective as the men who flew it, and those men were extraordinary. There is one more dimension of the B-36 story that deserves attention before we conclude, its cultural and symbolic importance. The B-36 entered American consciousness in ways that went beyond its role as a weapons system. It appeared in films, most notably the 1955 Strategic Air Command, starring James Stewart as a reserve officer recalled to active duty who flies B-30SXS, a film that was made with full Air Force cooperation and that served, quite deliberately, as a piece of public relations for Strategic Air Command and for the doctrine of nuclear deterrence that the B-36 embodied. The film showed the aircraft in loving detail, the long missions, the Arctic flying, the professionalism and dedication of the crews, and presented nuclear deterrence as noble, necessary, and fundamentally decent. Millions of Americans saw it, and their image of the B-36 was shaped in part by what they saw on screen. The aircraft also appeared in the anxious cultural productions of the early nuclear age, the novels, the short stories, the magazine articles that tried to grapple with what it meant to live in a world where machines like the B-36 existed, where a single aircraft could carry enough destructive power to end human civilization, where the peace was kept not by goodwill or diplomacy, but by the threat of mutual annihilation. This cultural presence, this role as a symbol of the nuclear age, with all its terror and its strange, cold rationality, is part of the B-30SIX's legacy in a way that is distinct from its purely military significance. The B-36 was not just an aircraft. It was an idea made of aluminum and steel and jet fuel. The idea that security could be purchased with terror. The idea that peace could be kept by the permanent readiness to destroy. The idea, which we still live with today, which shapes the world we inhabit, that the way to prevent nuclear war is to be ready, always, to fight one. The nickname Peacemaker, given to the B-36 officially when it entered service, carries all of this ambiguity in 4 syllables. The peacemaker, in traditional usage, is someone who resolves conflicts, who brings people together, who finds ways to prevent violence. The B-36 B-36 Peacemaker kept the peace, if it did, by being the most terrifying instrument of violence the world had ever produced. The contradiction is not accidental. It is, in many ways, the central contradiction of the nuclear age, the idea that mass destruction and peace can coexist, that the bomb and the olive branch are not opposites but complements. Whether you find that idea reassuring or horrifying probably depends on what you think about human nature and the history of the past 80 years. But the B-36 Peacemaker, sitting on the ramp at Carswell Air Force Base in the early morning cold of a Texas winter in 1953, armed with hydrogen bombs and crewed by men drinking bad coffee and waiting for the phone that might never ring, was that idea in its most concrete and unmistakable form. 6 turning for burning. 10 engines. 230 feet of wing. 400,000 pounds of machine and fuel and weapons and the weight of human civilization resting on the shoulders of 15 men in 2 pressurized compartments connected by a crawl tunnel. This was the B-36 Peacemaker. This was American power at its most awesome and its most troubling. This was the machine that stood between the world and World War III, or so its creators believed, and so its crews trusted, and so its adversaries feared. It flew for 13 years. It never dropped a bomb in anger, and it changed the world. Now here is a question I want to leave with you, and I genuinely want to know what you think in the comments below. If the B-36 Peacemaker had been used in actual combat, if the Cold War had turned hot in 1950 or 1951 or 1952, and the order had come to launch the B-36 against Soviet cities, do you believe nuclear deterrence would have worked as its architects claimed, and the Soviets would have backed down? Or do you believe that having such a weapon made war more likely rather than less? Think about it. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you found this history as extraordinary as I do, hit that subscribe button, because the stories of the machines and the men who defined the Cold War are only just getting started.